The rain wasn't just falling, it was hammering the windshield, a relentless assault against my 10-hour fatigue. My spine felt like a fused rod of tension as I stood at the reception desk of the Vesper, water dripping from my coat onto the polished floor. "I'm so sorry," the receptionist said, her voice thin and final. "We are completely overbooked." The lobby smelled of cedar and safety, while my car outside was a freezing metal box. I was calculating the misery of sleeping upright in the sedan when a voice cut through the quiet jazz. "I have a room," she said, "and I don't snore." I turned slowly. The lobby of the Vesper was designed to make you forget the world outside existed. Heavy velvet drapes shut out the lightning, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive beeswax candles and old, polished wood. It was a sanctuary for people who could afford to disappear for a weekend, a place of hushed tones and soft surfaces. I was just trying to survive the night. I am a woman of schedules, of precision. My life is a series of carefully calibrated movements, and standing there in a damp trench coat with a receptionist looking at me like a charity case was not on the itinerary. "There really isn't anything?" I asked again, leaning heavily against the reception desk to keep my legs from folding. "The storm grounded 3 flights, the receptionist said, her hands fluttering uselessly over the keyboard. "Every room within 50 miles is taken. I've called the motels in the next town, but they're full too." "I told you," the voice came again, closer this time. "I have a suite. It has a fire. You look like you need both." She was standing by the massive stone fireplace, one arm resting casually on the mantel. She didn't look like a traveler who had been caught by the weather. She looked like she owned the weather. Dark hair fell in loose waves around a face that was striking not for its beauty, though she was beautiful, but for its absolute calm. She wore a silk blouse that caught the firelight, and her eyes, dark and amused, held mine with an unflinching gaze. She radiated a sultry confidence that felt dangerous to my ordered world, the kind of woman who didn't just walk into a room, but changed its temperature. "I can't ask you to do that," I said, my voice sounding stiffer than I intended. "You didn't ask," she replied, taking a sip from a crystal tumbler. "I offered. I'm Lizzie." She didn't move to shake my hand. She just stood there, letting the silence stretch between us. I felt the cold water seeping through my shoes. The contrast between us was stark. Me, frayed edges and exhaustion. Her, polished edges and ease. "I'm tired," I admitted, the fight draining out of me. "I can see that," Lizzie said. Her voice dropped an octave, intimate and low. "The roads are a mess. You have white knuckles." She gestured with her glass toward the receptionist. "Put her on my bill. The bridal suite." The receptionist blinked, looking between us. "Are you sure, Miss Vance?" "Quite," Lizzie, or Ms. Vance said, never looking away from me. "Unless you prefer the car?" It wasn't a question of preference. It was a question of survival. But there was something else in the offer, a current running beneath the surface of the transaction. It felt less like a favor and more like a dare. She watched me weigh the options, the freezing isolation of the sedan versus the unpredictable heat of sharing a room with a woman who looked at me like she was reading a book she already knew the ending to. "I'll pay for half," I said, clinging to the last shred of my control. Lizzie smiled then, a slow, deliberate curving of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes, but warmed the air between us nonetheless. "We can discuss the finances later," she said, setting her glass down. "Right now, I think you need a drink more than you need a receipt." She picked up her keycard from the side table. It was a heavy, brass thing, old-fashioned and substantial. "Coming?" I looked at the receptionist, who shrugged helplessly, then back at Lizzie. My precision, my rules, my schedule, they all dissolved under the weight of my exhaustion and the pull of that gaze. I nodded, the movement feeling heavy. It was a decision made out of necessity, I told myself firmly. Just a place to sleep, a temporary alignment of needs. But as I grabbed the handle of my luggage and turned to follow her toward the elevators, the air around us seemed to charge, thickening with the humidity of the storm outside, and something entirely different and far more volatile inside. The safety of the lobby suddenly felt like the edge of a cliff I had just agreed to jump off. The walk from the reception desk to the elevator bank was short, but the silence that stretched between us made it feel like miles. It wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, filled with the weight of Lizzie's assessment. I could feel her eyes on me, not in a predatory way, but with a curiosity that felt invasive to someone who had spent the last 10 hours in the solitary confinement of a sedan. My suitcase wheels hummed against the thick, expensive carpet, a dull, rhythmic sound that seemed to underscore my exhaustion. I kept my eyes forward, focused on the brass numbers above the elevator doors, trying to maintain the professional armor that usually kept the world at a manageable distance. But the armor was cracked, leaking fatigue, and I knew she could see it. "You drive with a lot of intensity," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient jazz of the lobby. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, delivered with that same low, textured cadence that had stopped me at the desk. "I have a schedule," I replied, pressing the call button with more force than necessary. I was supposed to be in the city by midnight. The storm wasn't part of the logistics. "Logistics," she repeated, tasting the word like it was a foreign spice. "You sound like you live your life in a spreadsheet." "It keeps things orderly," I defended, though my voice lacked its usual bite. "What do you do that allows you to be so unbothered?" "I sculpt," Lizzie said, the elevator doors sliding open with a soft chime. We stepped inside, and the space immediately shrank. Metal, mostly. It requires heat and force, but mostly it requires listening to the material. You can't force the steel to bend if it doesn't want to. You have to find the flow. The doors closed, sealing us in a box of mirrored walls and dim lighting. The air instantly thickened, charged with a sudden, undeniable intimacy. I could smell her perfume now, a complex, earthy mix of sandalwood and rain that seemed to bypass my defenses and settle somewhere deep in my chest. It was a scent that spoke of dark rooms and deliberate choices, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air of my car. I gripped the handle of my luggage tighter, trying to ground myself in the familiar texture of the plastic. Lizzie turned to me, her body angled so that she commanded the small space. She didn't look at my face. Her gaze dropped to my hand, white-knuckled on the grip of the suitcase. "You're still driving," she murmured, her eyes lifting to meet mine. The look was unflinching, a direct challenge that made my breath hitch. "We're stopped, darling. You can let go of the wheel." The nickname "darling" was casual, tossed out like it meant nothing, but it landed with the weight of a stone in a still pond. I felt a flush rise in my neck, a betrayal of my body that I couldn't suppress. I loosened my grip, flexed my stiff fingers, and tried to reassemble my composure. "Look," I said, turning to face the doors, needing to break the visual connection. "I appreciate the offer, really, but I want to be clear. I'll transfer you the money for half the room rate as soon as we get upstairs. This is a temporary arrangement, a business transaction to solve a logistical error." I heard the shift in the air before she spoke, a subtle change in pressure that told me she had moved closer. "A business transaction," she laughed, a low, throaty sound that vibrated against my skin. "You really are committed to your categories, aren't you? But I should warn you, business doesn't usually happen in a bridal suite. And I have a feeling that tonight is going to be anything but transactional." Before I could process the implication, the elevator chimed again. The doors slid open, revealing a hallway that stretched out in silence, leading to a room that suddenly felt far too intimate for strangers. The lock disengaged with a heavy, satisfying thud, and Lizzie pushed the door open. If the elevator had been a box of intimacy, the suite was a cathedral of it. It was undeniably, aggressively romantic. The lighting was low, amber and gold, emanating from sconces that looked like they belonged in a 1920s speakeasy. Heavy velvet curtains, the color of crushed garnets, were drawn tight against the storm, muffling the thunder to a dull, rhythmic thrum. A fire was already lit in the grate, gas-fed but convincing, casting long, dancing shadows across the Persian rug. It was a room designed for lovers, for whispered confessions and tangled limbs, not for two strangers brought together by a meteorological error. And then there was the bed. It dominated the center of the room, a massive four-poster island of crisp white linen and excessive pillows. It was beautiful. It was inviting. And it was singular. I stopped in the entryway, my suitcase bumping against my heels, and stared at it. The math was simple, brutal, and immediate. 1 bed, 2 women, 0 alternative options. "It's cozy," I managed, the word tasting like dust in my mouth. "It's the Vesper suite," Lizzie corrected, walking past me. She didn't just walk, she flowed into the room, tossing her key onto the side table with a casual, careless grace that suggested she spent every night in rooms that cost more than my car payments. They don't do cozy here, they do grand. She moved to the window, pulling back the edge of the heavy curtain to peer out at the deluge, her silhouette cut sharp against the dim light. I stayed by the door, gripping my luggage handle like it was a lifeline to sanity. I needed boundaries. I needed lines drawn in the sand. I scanned the room for a safe harbor and spotted a small antique writing desk in the far corner, safely removed from the gravitational pull of the bed. I gestured vaguely with my free hand, marching toward the desk. I have some emails to answer. I'll set up a workspace here. Keep out of your way. I began unpacking my laptop, my charger, my notebook, arranging them in a precise grid on the polished wood. It was a futile attempt to impose order on chaos, to claim a square footage of territory that followed my rules. I was building a fortress out of office supplies. Lizzie turned from the window, watching me. She hadn't taken off her coat yet, but she looked more at home in the center of the room than I did in my designated corner. She moved toward the center of the space, trailing a hand along the back of a velvet armchair. It was a proprietary gesture, a claiming of the territory simply by existing in it. She wasn't trying to hide her presence or minimize her footprint. She was expanding to fill the vacuum I was trying so hard to create. "You're building a wall," she observed, her voice amused. "I'm setting up my office," I corrected, not looking up from the alignment of my pens. "Like I said, business." "You're fascinating," she murmured, and suddenly she was close. Too close. I turned and she was there, standing just on the other side of my desk. The barrier felt laughably thin. She reached out, not for me, but for the brass room key I had unconsciously left sitting on the corner of the desk next to my phone. I reached for it at the same moment, an instinctive reflex to control the access point. Our fingers collided. It wasn't a brush. It was an impact. The contact was electric, a sharp, static snap that seemed to arc all the way up my arm and ground itself in the base of my spine. I jerked my hand back, startled not by the static, but by the heat of her skin, the sudden, shocking reality of her physical presence. The air in the room seemed to vanish, sucked out by the sudden vacuum of tension. I looked up, breath caught in my throat. Lizzie hadn't pulled back. Her hand rested over the key, her fingers long and elegant, but her eyes were locked on mine. The amusement was gone, replaced by something darker, heavier. She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't say "gotcha." "Static," I whispered, the excuse flimsy. "If you say so," Lizzie replied softly. Her gaze dropped to my hand, then back to my eyes, a silent acknowledgement that we both knew it was more than friction and carpet. She tapped the key once, a slow, deliberate sound against the wood, then turned and walked toward the fireplace. The moment broke, but the charge remained. I stood frozen in my corner, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely, desperate sound. But inside, the silence was louder. The storm had sealed us in, and the room, expansive as it was, suddenly felt like the smallest place on earth. I turned back to my suitcase, the zipper hissing loudly in the quiet room. Unpacking in front of a stranger is a peculiar kind of intimacy. It isn't about the nudity of the body, but the revelation of habits. The way I folded my shirts, the precise alignment of my toiletries, the worn spine of the book I kept buried at the bottom. It all felt like a confession I wasn't ready to make. I tried to shield the contents of my bag with my body, moving with stiff motions, transferring items from the suitcase to the dresser as if I were handling contraband. "You pack like you're expecting a customs inspection," Lizzie said. I glanced over my shoulder. She had settled into the velvet armchair by the fire, legs crossed, a glass of dark red wine balanced effortlessly in her hand. She had shed her coat, revealing the slope of her shoulders in the silk blouse. The firelight played across her skin, casting her in bronze and shadow. She wasn't looking at the dancing flames. She was watching me. Her gaze was heavy, a physical weight on my back. "Efficiency," I muttered, placing a stack of files on the nightstand. "It saves time." "Time for what?" she asked. The question was soft, but it hooked under my ribs. You're driving through a hurricane to get to a meeting that probably could have been an email. What are you running from, darling? I froze, a silk blouse half unfolded in my hands. The question cut through the polite fiction of the business trip. I wanted to tell her to mind her own business, to retreat to her side of the room. But the truth was, the silence in the car had been deafening for 6 hours, and the sound of her voice was a lifeline. I'm not running, I lied, then sighed, the fight draining out of my shoulders. I turned to face her, leaning back against the heavy dresser. I felt like if I stopped moving, the walls of my apartment would close in. My life is managed. It's safe. It's predictable. And suddenly, safe felt like a coffin. Lizzie took a slow, deliberate sip of wine, her eyes never leaving mine. Safety is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night, she said, her voice dropping to that husky register that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. I don't want safe. I want the burn. I want to feel the heat of the kiln, the resistance of the metal. If it doesn't scare you a little, it's not worth doing. You have to chase the fire, or you turn to ash. Her words stripped away another layer of my defense. She saw me. Not the project manager with the spreadsheets, but the woman standing in a damp hotel room, terrified of her own boredom. It was uncomfortable, this visibility. It felt like being examined under a microscope, but the lens was warm. I turned back to my bag, flustered, my hands shaking slightly. I reached for my toiletry kit, but my fingers were clumsy, betraying my nerves. It slipped, tumbling toward the floor. I've got it, we both said. I dove for it. Lizzie moved with that fluid grace, sliding from the chair to the floor in one motion. We reached for the leather handle at the same time. My hand landed on the bag, hers landed on mine. The world narrowed down to that single point of contact. Her skin was warm, dry, and terrifyingly real. I looked up. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in her iris, the faint flush on her cheekbones, the way her breath hitched, just once. The smell of sandalwood and rain filled my lungs, drowning out the cedar. She didn't pull back. She let her fingers curl slightly around my hand, trapping it against the leather. The moment stretched, elastic and taut. She was testing me, waiting to see if I would run or if I would lean in. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I wanted to lean in. Then, a loud rumble from my stomach shattered the silence. Lizzie blinked, the intensity breaking into a startled laugh. She sat back on her heels, releasing my hand. Well, she said, a wicked grin spreading across her face. I suppose we can't survive on tension alone. Let's get food. The bar at the Vesper was a cavern of liquid amber light and shadows that seemed to breathe. It was the kind of place where people came to be alone together, the air thick with the scent of bitters, orange peel, and old leather. It was a masculine scent, heavy and traditional, but Lizzie cut through it like a blade. Walking into the room with her was an education in gravity. She didn't demand attention, she simply assumed it, and the room obliged. Men looked up from their scotches, women paused in their conversations. But Lizzie didn't spare them a glance. She moved through the crowd with a singular focus, her eyes fixed on me as if I were the only variable in the room that mattered. We found a small, round marble table in the corner, barely big enough for our elbows, forcing a proximity that felt intentional. I ordered a gin and tonic, clear, sharp, predictable. Lizzie ordered a bourbon, neat. When the drinks arrived, the alcohol hit my empty stomach with a warm, loosening hum. The rigid grid of my anxiety began to blur at the edges, the sharp lines of my schedule softening into something more fluid. You have a very loud mind, Lizzie said, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. I can hear the gears grinding from here. I'm just observing, I deflected, taking a long sip. The gin was cold, but my face felt hot. It's a habit. It's a shield, she corrected. Her voice was lower here, competing with the morning jazz in the background, forcing me to lean in. The table between us felt less like a barrier and more like a conductor, transmitting the heat of her gaze directly into my chest. You analyze everything so you don't have to feel it. You're dissecting me right now, aren't you? Trying to figure out where I fit in your spreadsheet. You don't fit, I admitted, the alcohol making me bold. You're unformatted data. Lizzie laughed, a sound that made the bartender look up. Unformatted data. I like that. It sounds dangerous. She leaned forward, her face catching the candlelight, illuminating the curve of her throat. You're smarter than you let on, darling. You play the part of the tired corporate drone, but there's a fire in you. I saw it upstairs. You wanted to touch that key. You wanted the spark. I opened my mouth to deny it, but a shadow fell over our table. A man, polished and confident in the way that mediocrity often is, stood there with a smile that was all teeth. Ladies, he started, the word dripping with assumption. You look like you need some company. Can I buy you around? The intrusion was jarring, a splash of cold water on a warm wire. I instinctively started to formulate a polite refusal, the social script I had been taught to recite to keep the peace. But Lizzie didn't look at him. She didn't even blink. She kept her eyes locked on mine, her expression sharpening into something possessive, a sudden steel beneath the silk. She's not thirsty, Lizzie said. Her voice didn't rise, but the temperature at the table dropped 10 degrees. And we're in the middle of a very private negotiation. I just thought, the man stammered, his confidence faltering against her wall of indifference. Don't think, Lizzie said, finally glancing at him with a look that could have cut glass. Just walk away. He did. He retreated instantly, muttering an apology. The thrill that shot through me wasn't just relief. It was a dark, electric jolt of being claimed. Lizzie turned back to me, the sharpness vanishing, replaced by that heavy, lidded heat. You let people take up too much of your space, she murmured. You give away your time like it's cheap. It isn't. I was just being polite, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. Polite as a cage, she said. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing the pulse point of my wrist. My heart jumped against her skin. I think you're just afraid to say what you want, because once you say it, you have to chase it. And chasing things is messy. It's unpredictable. It ruins the schedule. The bartender called out for last orders, the lights flickering overhead to signal the end of the night. The spell was suspended, but not broken. We stood up, the alcohol humming in our veins, and walked toward the elevators. The safety of the crowd was gone now. We were heading back to the isolation of the suite, and the question hung in the air between us, unanswered and dangerous, as we ascended back into the dark. The elevator doors slid open onto a hallway that had been transformed. Gone was the warm, hotel-standard lighting, replaced by the sterile, greenish wash of emergency strobes. The storm had done more than just trap us. It had severed the building's connection to the grid. The silence in the corridor was absolute, heavy enough to press against my eardrums. We walked to the suite without speaking, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the carpet, the air thick with the realization that the world outside had truly stopped. The electronic hum of the building, the vending machines, the distant HVAC, the elevators, was dead. We were drifting in a capsule of silence. When Lizzie pushed the door open, the room was a cave of shadows and gold. The gas fireplace was still roaring, casting long, dancing shapes across the walls. The electric sconces were dead. The darkness wasn't empty. It was velvety and intimate, shrinking the massive suite down to the radius of the hearth's glow. It felt timeless, like we had stepped out of the 21st century and into a place where clocks and schedules held no dominion. The shadows played tricks on the periphery of my vision, making the room feel endless and yet impossibly small, centered entirely on the rug before the fire. Perfect, Lizzie whispered, closing the door behind us. The lock clicked, a final, decisive sound in the quiet. Civilization has officially left the building. She moved toward the fire, the silk of her blouse catching the orange light like liquid metal. I should have gone to the bathroom, changed into my pajamas, and retreated to the safety of the bed's far edge. That was the logical next step. That was the plan. But the plan felt distant now, a relic of a woman who hadn't just spent an hour being dissected by Lizzie's gaze. The darkness made the bed look like an island I wasn't ready to swim to. But the fire was a beacon. We have a little wine left, Lizzie said, picking up the bottle from the side table. She didn't sit in the armchair this time. She sank gracefully onto the thick Persian rug directly in front of the fire, patted the space beside her, and looked up at me. It wasn't a request. It was an invitation to abandon the high ground. I hesitated for a heartbeat. my internal alarm bells ringing a distant warning, then silenced them. I walked over and sat down. Not on the chair, but on the floor, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her arm, close enough that the scent of sandalwood was stronger than the wood smoke. The physical distance between us, which I had tried so hard to maintain with desks and tables, had evaporated. We were sitting inside the boundary line now. "The fire suits you," she said softly, handing me a glass. "It softens the edges you try so hard to keep sharp." I took the glass, my fingers brushing hers. The static was gone, replaced by a steady, humming warmth. "I'm not trying to be sharp," I murmured, staring into the flames, watching a log crumble into glowing embers. "I'm just trying to hold it together." "Why?" Lizzie asked. She shifted, turning her body fully toward me. "What happens if you fall apart? What happens if you just let go?" She reached out then. Her hand moved slowly, telegraphing the intent, so I had every chance to pull away. I didn't. Her fingers grazed my temple, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The touch was feather-light, but it hit my system like a shockwave. Her fingertips lingered on the sensitive skin behind my ear, tracing the line of my jaw with a thumb that felt impossibly hot against my skin. It was a deliberate, studying touch, as if she were learning the shape of my resistance. I froze. Not out of fear. The fear was gone, burned away by the bourbon and the fire, but out of a sudden, terrifying clarity. I wasn't freezing to stop her. I was freezing to feel it. I realized, with a jolt that nearly made me drop my glass, that I didn't want her to stop. I wanted her hand to slide down to my neck. I wanted the space between us to close completely. The desire wasn't a slow creep. It was a landslide, sudden and total, burying my logic under tons of visceral want. "You're trembling," she whispered, her eyes searching mine, dark and unreadable in the firelight. "I'm not cold," I managed to say, my voice barely a breath. "I know," Lizzie replied. She let her hand rest there, claiming the space, her thumb brushing my cheekbone. Neither am I. The conversation died, suffocated by the weight of what was happening. There was only the sound of the rain lashing against the glass and the crackle of the logs, a rhythm that matched the pounding of my own blood. We sat there, suspended in the amber light, the boundary between stranger and something else, dissolving with every second that ticked by in the dark. I stood up too quickly. The combination of the wine, the heat, and the terrifying softness of her thumb on my jaw made the room spin. "I need to get ready," I stammered. It was a retreat, plain and simple. I grabbed my toiletry bag and fled to the bathroom, closing the heavy door behind me with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet suite. Inside, the darkness was absolute until I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone. The beam cut a stark, white cone through the steam. I set it on the marble counter, creating jagged shadows that danced against the tile. I turned on the tap, splashing cold water onto my face, trying to shock the heat out of my skin. I scrubbed hard, washing away the road grit, the stale air of the car, and the polite, professional mask I wore for receptionists and clients. When I finally looked up, water dripping from my chin, the woman in the mirror was a stranger. Her eyes were wide, dark pupils swallowing the iris. Her cheeks were flushed a deep, hectic rose that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the woman sitting on the other side of the door. I looked alive. Terrified, yes, but vividly, undeniably present. I touched my own cheek, tracing the path Lizzie's thumb had taken. The skin still felt branded. It was disorienting to recognize myself, only because a stranger had pointed me out. "Do you need anything?" Lizzie's voice drifted through the wood, muffled but intimate. It wasn't a shout. She knew I could hear her. The suite was too quiet for secrets. "I'm fine," I called back, my voice sounding breathless even to my own ears. "Just a minute." I wasn't fine. I was unraveling. I stripped off my clothes, the tailored slacks, the blouse that buttoned to the throat, and they fell in a heap of stiff fabric on the floor. My armor. Without it, I felt dangerously light. I pulled on my sleepwear, a worn, soft cotton tank top and shorts that I usually found comforting. Now, they felt flimsy. They felt like tissue paper against a hurricane. I brushed my teeth in the semi-darkness, the mundane ritual feeling surreal against the backdrop of the storm and the heavy, expectant silence waiting for me outside. I couldn't stay in there forever. I took a deep breath, gripped the doorknob, and stepped back out into the firelight. Lizzie had moved. She wasn't by the fire anymore. She was standing by the window, looking out at the rain, but she turned the moment the latch clicked. She had changed too. The silk blouse was gone, replaced by a slip of night-dark satin that clung to her frame like water. It was elegant, fluid, and devastating. She looked entirely at ease, a creature of midnight and shadows, while I felt like a teenager caught out past curfew. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't just social anymore. It wasn't two travelers sharing a resource. Seeing each other prepped for sleep, stripped of our daytime layers, shifted the atmosphere into something domestic and primal. It was the intimacy of shared rituals, of the hours usually reserved for lovers or solitude. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me, her gaze traveling from my bare feet to my face, taking in the cotton shorts, the lack of makeup, the raw honesty of my skin. She didn't smile. She just watched, and the air between us thickened, heavy with everything we weren't saying. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of questions I wasn't brave enough to answer yet. There was nowhere left to look, nowhere left to hide. The bathroom door was closed behind me, the fire was in front of me, and the only place left to go was the bed. We approached the bed like two diplomats, negotiating a treaty neither of us had the authorization to sign. It was a king-size mattress, wide enough to sleep a family of 4, yet as I stood by the bedside table, it felt terrifyingly narrow. I placed my phone on the nightstand with deliberate precision, aligning it parallel to the edge of the wood, a final, desperate attempt to impose geometry on a situation that was rapidly becoming fluid. "I'll take the left," I said, my voice tight. "I sleep on the left at home." "Creatures of habit," Lizzie murmured. She was already sliding under the duvet on the right side, her movements rustling the crisp, expensive cotton. She didn't wear pajamas. The satin slip she had changed into was a whisper against the sheets, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room. "Don't worry, darling. I stay on my side. Mostly." I stiffened, then forced myself to relax, sliding into the cool embrace of the linens. I kept to the absolute edge of the mattress, my back to her, carving out a demilitarized zone of empty white space between us. It was a ridiculous gesture, a child's fort built against an encroaching tide. I reached out and clicked off the small, battery-operated lamp she had placed on the table. The darkness was instantaneous and absolute. With the visual world erased, the other senses rushed in to fill the void, amplified and overwhelming. The room wasn't silent. It was alive. I could hear the rain drumming a relentless, hypnotic rhythm against the glass, sealing us into this dark capsule. But louder than the storm was the sound of Lizzie breathing. It was slow, steady, a rhythmic tide that pulled at my own uneven breaths. I could feel the depression in the mattress where her weight settled, a gravitational pull that urged me to roll backward, toward the center, toward her. And the heat. God, the heat. Even across the expanse of the sheet, I could feel her warmth radiating like a banked fire. It was a physical presence, a magnetic field that prickled against the skin of my back. I lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the invisible wall, hyper-aware of every micro-movement she made. The shift of a hip, the slide of satin against cotton, the soft exhale of a sigh. Each one sent a jolt through my nervous system. "You're thinking so loud you're going to wake the neighbors." Her voice came out of the blackness, soft and stripped of its usual performative edge. "There are no neighbors," I whispered back. "The hotel is empty." "Exactly," she said. "So why are you clinging to the edge of the bed like you're about to fall off a cliff?" "I'm respecting boundaries," I lied. "You're building walls," she corrected. There was a pause, filled only by the crackle of the dying fire across the room. Then her voice shifted, losing the teasing lilt, becoming something rawer. "Does it get lonely? The precision, the schedule, the safety?" I hesitated. The darkness made the truth easier to access, dissolving the shame of vulnerability. "Yes," I admitted, the word barely a breath. "Sometimes it feels like like I'm preserving a museum exhibit that no one visits. It's perfect, and it's cold. I know the feeling, Lizzie said. The admission surprised me. She seemed so contained, so complete. You? I asked, turning my head slightly into the pillow. But you chase the fire. You have the burn. The fire is warm, she whispered. But it doesn't hold you back. Confidence is just a shield, darling. It's the armor I wear, so no one sees that I'm just as terrified of the quiet as you are. I fill the silence with noise and motion and heat, so I don't have to hear the echo. The confession hung in the air, heavy and fragile. She wasn't the untouchable sculptor anymore. She was just a woman lying in the dark, admitting that the chaos she courted was just another way to run. It broke something in me, the last resistance, the final strut of my defensive structure. I rolled over. I didn't think about it. I just moved. I turned onto my side, facing the center of the bed. In the faint, dying glow of the embers, I could just make out the curve of her shoulder, the shadow of her face. She had turned too. We were lying face to face, the demilitarized zone having shrunk to a scant few inches. I could feel her breath on my cheek now, warm and smelling of wine and secrets. The distance between us was less than a breath, a charged electric gap that hummed with potential. The verbal barriers were gone, dissolved by the dark and the truth. All that was left was the physical line, and it was blurring fast. The silence had texture now, heavy and woven with the ragged sound of our breathing. I stared into the dark abyss of the few inches separating us, the border I had insisted upon with such professional rigidity, and suddenly it looked less like a safety measure and more like a prison wall. My heart was pounding a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat demanding action. I had spent my entire adult life adhering to the itinerary, staying in the lane marked safe. But lying there in the dark, inhaling the complex scent of sandalwood, rain, and her skin, I realized that safety was just another word for stasis. And I was done being still. It was me who moved. Not the sculptor who chased the fire, but the driver who feared the skid. My hand moved across the cool expanse of the cotton sheet, a trembling explorer in the dark. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the warmth of her wrist. Lizzie went perfectly still. Her breath hitched, a sharp intake of air that was loud in the quiet room. She held her ground, but she didn't take over either. She waited. She was giving me the control, letting me set the pace of the collision. That stillness was a dare, and I took it. I slid my hand down, interlacing my fingers with hers. Her grip tightened instantly, strong and grounding, an anchor in the storm. Lizzie, I whispered, and the name felt like a prayer and a confession all at once. I shifted my weight, the mattress dipping as I crossed the invisible line. I moved closer, until our knees brushed, until the heat radiating from her body wasn't just a sensation, but an atmosphere I was breathing in. She tilted her head, her eyes catching the faint, dying glow of the embers, watching me with that same unflinching intensity she had worn in the lobby. But there was no mockery now, no teasing, only a raw, open waiting. I leaned in. The distance closed. I kissed her. It wasn't a frantic, desperate collision. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a question asked and answered in the same breath. My lips brushed hers, tentative at first, testing the reality of it. And then, as she sighed into my mouth, the hesitation shattered. The kiss deepened, becoming a conversation of pressure and heat. Her lips were soft, tasting faintly of the bourbon and the dark, but underneath the softness was the steel she had talked about, the strength of the metal she bent to her will. She made a low sound in her throat, a vibration that I felt in my own chest, and her free hand came up to tangle in my hair, pulling me closer. The distance vanished. There was no left side or right side anymore. There was only the center, where we were tangled together. I pressed closer, needing to feel the length of her against me, the contrast of her cool satin slip against my heated skin. This was the burn she had promised. It wasn't destructive. It was clarifying. It seared away the exhaustion, the schedules, the rigid expectations of who I was supposed to be. In the circle of her arms, with the storm raging uselessly against the glass, I wasn't the tired driver or the project manager. I was just a woman on fire, finally letting herself feel the heat without looking for the exit. The room fell away. The world fell away. There was only the texture of her skin, the rhythm of her heart beating against mine, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And for the first time in 10 years, I didn't want to go back to the cold. Light filtered through the heavy curtains, not the amber glow of the fire, but the soft, bruised gray of a storm that had spent itself. I woke up first. Usually, waking up in a strange bed brings a jolt of panic, a frantic scramble to reassemble the self. But this morning, there was only a profound, anchoring calm. The room was cool, the fire reduced to white ash, but the warmth remained under the duvet. Lizzie was still asleep. In the morning light, stripped of the shadows and the wine, she looked younger, the sharp angles of her confidence softened by rest. Her dark hair was a chaotic spill across the white pillowcase, her breathing a slow, steady rhythm that I found myself unconsciously matching. My internal scheduler was already whispering, listing the emails I had missed, the miles I still had to drive. It would be easy. Slide out, dress in the bathroom, leave a polite, vague note on the desk. I looked at her hand resting on the sheet, the same hand that had pulled me into the fire. I picked up the room service phone and ordered coffee for 2. Then I sat in the velvet armchair, wrapped in the thick hotel robe, and waited. When she finally opened her eyes, there was no confusion, no moment of recalibration. She saw me sitting there, and a slow, sleepy smile spread across her face. It wasn't the predatory grin of the lobby or the knowing smirk of the bar. It was soft. It was open. "You're still here," she murmured, her voice rough with sleep. "The roads are still wet," I said, lifting my cup. "And I hate driving without coffee." "Liar," she said gently, sitting up and pulling the sheet around her. "You stayed." "I stayed," I admitted. We drank the coffee in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence in the elevator. It wasn't heavy with assessment. It was light, easy. We didn't exchange resumes or promises of forever. We just existed in the quiet aftermath. "I have to go," I said eventually, the reality of the day pressing in. "I know," Lizzie said. She didn't ask for my number. She just looked at me with that unflinching gaze. "The fire doesn't stop just because you leave the room, darling. Next time, don't wait for a storm." "Next time," I echoed. And it felt like a promise. The air in the parking lot was scrubbed clean, smelling of ozone and wet asphalt. The world looked different, sharper, brighter, as if the storm had washed away the gray film of my routine. We didn't say goodbye, we just nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the story wasn't over, just paused. I got into my car and turned the key. The road ahead was the same, but the woman driving it had changed. If you've ever found clarity in the arms of a stranger, subscribe for more.